Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project, a platform for peer-to-peer conversations with the people that are helping to shape the carbon markets of tomorrow. Join me, Rene Velasquez, as I get to have conversations on topics ranging from ESG and finance over cocktails in the Lion City of Singapore. Cheers. We have a very interesting conversation today from the viewpoint of a scientist. Akash Verma joins me to discuss the role and importance of nature-based solutions, and he lends his incredible expertise and discusses how best to quantify the emissions embedded in terrestrial systems. Akash, welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project. It's a pleasure to have you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, man. Super excited.
Yeah, as am I. I was just telling you before we started rolling that I'm really keen to learn from you. Just as a bit of background, if you'll indulge me. So we've met only once before, but I think we got along really well. I think the banter and the dialogue spark was there, yeah. Right? But I find obviously the work that you're doing really fascinating. But effectively, you're the first scientist that I've got on the podcast, and the scientific voice and scientific community is so integral in terms of just the rigor and the integrity that science has and it's a voice that's been missing oftentimes from the dialogue. I think we were talking off camera a little bit earlier around scientists in general are really open to discussing error, right? They're really conscious about it because they understand that in order to disclose that, it's then helps them to actually obviously reduce those error bars over time. And that narrative is effectively been hijacked by many well-intending folks in the media side. But I wanted to address that and dive head in and really learn from you from a scientific perspective. Let's talk about nature-based solutions and let's do a deep dive. So that's my very broad introduction. Can you give us a little bit of introduction about how you first arrived in this space and then the type of work that you're doing?
Okay. Thank you. I think the conversation is going to be really nice. I'm excited. I was one of those really nerdy biology students back in school.
Yep.
And I initially thought I want to go towards medicine, but I ended up in engineering.
Okay.
That was one of those decisions as a teenager I made.
Mech-eng or?
Electronics, communication engineering, yeah. Okay. And my first job was actually a software engineer.
Okay.
But my cubicle was near the window and it was actually overlooking a national park.
Okay, great.
And at about 6 months in, I was like, I don't want to be here. I want to be there.
You want to be there.
And my girlfriend, not my wife, she was like, why don't you give it a shot? Like, you still have the acumen for it, for the science part of it. So I got into environmental sciences. And this is back in 2011, and I was in India.
Okay.
And it was just an emerging field. I remember my dad, he comes from a diplomatic government background, and he was nervous. He's like, are there even jobs for this?
Are there jobs for this?
And I was like, it's, if you're good at it, you'll find a space for yourself. That was his...
The exuberance of youth, but I agree completely with that statement then and still now.
Yeah, and as a master's student, I ended up working on marine turtles in the eastern coast of India.
Oh, fascinating.
I spent time in the central part of India helping friends do work on crocodiles, and it was
what type of work?
We were ecology work. We were looking at he was looking at how crocodiles, the gharials in India, how they choose their nesting sites on the banks and how it'll change depending on the flow of the water and the food that's available. Super interesting study in the hinterlands of India. Love that field work, and I did field work.
The crocodiles with the really long
and the snout at that's the one, and they're very shy. People, I think. Make them look a lot more evil than they are. They're very shy creatures. Yeah. And that time I spent in the field was amazing. And I'm like, I love it here. Great. No matter how tired I am, I love it. And I ended up teaching afterwards for a while as a science teacher and then as an environmental science lecturer. But
I love this. So there's a very curiosity-driven, meandering path.
Like the river that the gharials lived in. And I loved it. But there was a part of me that was like, I love the classroom, but I love the forest as well.
Okay.
And I want to find a balance between the two where I can do both.
Oh, great.
And I ended up volunteering for a project that was looking at langurs, the primates in the Himalayas. That was my first time going to the mountains in India.
Wow.
And it's the mystic Himalayas, right?
Sure.
And we were camped up at 4,000 meters. We were hiking 15 kilometers a day, following primates, and I just fell in love with the forest and the ecosystem. And that's a very different forest from the ones you see in tropical Southeast
Of course,
Asia.
different forest.
And I was like, okay, I wanna learn more about the forest, and I wanted to move from an individual species to the ecosystem.
Okay.
And I feel like that's where my space was. So I joined NUS as a PhD student with back then it was the Applied Plant Ecology Lab, and I decided to work on understanding what drives forest change in the Himalayas.
Okay.
Partially because I'm an optimist, and there's always this conversation that's doomsday like apocalyptic, that the world is ending, the forest is on fire, there's deforestation. But the Himalayas is actually this space, very important space, between politically important as well.
Very
but
much so. In terms of like just the geopolitical
exactly,
side of things
but
as well. But
in terms of forest, there's actually a lot of forest recovery in that part. Even I was like, wow, there's patches of deforestation. It's natural part of the ecosystem because of the India's development, Nepal, Bhutan, parts of China as well. But then within that space, there's so much forest recovery happening, and especially Nepal. And this has been well documented now with spatial studies. And I was doing that. That was part of my PhD, and I was using satellite-based methods to understand that. I had a small project where we went and interviewed farmers in Nepal, because it turns out that one of the biggest opportunities for forest recovery and regrowth is abandoned agricultural land in Nepal.
really,
It was like a really serendipitous moment for me. I was like, oh, I want to look at forest recovery. I'm like, oh, where is a lot of this forest coming? And we looked out, it used to be farmland before. And Nepal has a very old tradition of community forestry. So community forestry combined with a lot of youth moving out of Nepal, and then the land becomes available, and some farmers just let it grow, and the forest takes what it
recovers.
can.
Yeah.
In some places they actively plant. So I love that part, and I was like, wow, this in the larger talk of climate change and carbon sequestration and sustainable development, there's a strip of land that is doing it already, while everyone else is talking about
I
it.
love that sense of optimism there,
Right?
because it's actually looking at it objectively and saying, hey, there's some really bright spots here, and there's also an opportunity, right?
And the Himalayas were known as the third pole in a way, because it packs ice so much. So
Sure.
the water that comes out of it feeds India and Bangladesh. That's like over 1 billion people that depend on it. So I was working on that, and then I was at NUS, and the opportunity came by to join the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions to work on understanding carbon and the sequestration that happens in the forest ecosystems, but in Southeast Asia.
Great.
And part of me is like, wow, I've worked in temperate and alpine ecosystems. I want to now work in tropical ecosystem, and that's another beast altogether.
I can imagine.
It's
a different density, a different biome. It's a completely different
hiking
thing.
for a field site in Nepal is very different for hiking to a field site in Indonesia.
You've got altitude and you've got temperature differences, and
But
you
it's
have
cool.
yes, exactly.
It's nice.
There's a lot
But
more humidity.
Indonesia, the forests are thick. Like the forest is loud. There's music and there's chirping, and then the trees are massive. This like I remember my first time in a southeast tropical forest here. I was like, I couldn't see the sky, and I was like, this is where the carbon is.
Yeah.
This is the climate mitigation, the climate change mitigation potential in these tropical forests is insane. And so I've been part of the team that's been working on how to improve the science behind improving the estimates of estimating carbon in these ecosystems. And it's a very exciting work.
That's fascinating. Thank you for that. That is it resonates with me in terms of that curiosity that just leads you on a winding path, like you said, to discover ultimately your calling, right? And I can tell from that introduction the passion that you have for the various different ecosystems. You mentioned ecosystems a number of times, and also looking at it from a solutions perspective, that this represents an incredible opportunity to value nature and to effectively help to quantify that. That's integral in order to achieve that outcome, to in terms of the value piece. So that's fantastic. Maybe we take a pause here, just have a quick drink. So cheers to that.
Cheers.
So, Akash, that's a really fascinating background. I want to unpack, if you'll indulge me, some of the nuggets essentially that you've planted here. You talked about ecosystems, and you said something really interesting to me, which was when you were referring to rainforest ecosystems, that's where the carbon is. Now, that's obvious to most people, right? Because essentially, high school biology, we learn about photosynthesis, et cetera. So it's a visible part of the sequestration potential, right? In terms of the forests. And like you said, the density is evident from space and in person. I want to unpack that space and time piece as well. But what other ecosystems are also representative of as essentially carbon sinks? Because it's more broad than just terrestrial, alpine, and like rainforests. Can you unpack that for me, please?
In terms of just the largest potential, I think oceans have it.
Really?
Right.
Just because of the scale.
Just out of complete scale. But on the land, and I'm going to focus in on Southeast Asia because that's where I'm working.
And we're in Singapore. That's very
exactly.
very.
If I was to look from space, I would see forest first, right? Tropical forests. That's the most apparent part, and that's something that people relate to the most. A lot of carbon there. But in terms of the density of carbon, it's what's beneath the forest. It's usually peat swamp or peatlands, which are spread across Southeast Asia. They are, I mean, the largest ones and the intact ones are, for example, in Indonesia. They're in the Philippines. We are working in one of the sites there. And the smaller ones across in Malaysia as well and other parts. But in terms of the density, peat swamps, they outcompete any other ecosystem.
Wow.
We're starting to better understand the carbon dynamics in mangrove, because mangroves is above the ground, it's mangrove, but there's a lot locked in the soil as well.
Of course.
But we still think peat swamp peat is number one in terms of density.
In terms of density.
Then probably mangrove, and then these old growth tropical terrestrial forests.
Okay.
In terms of spatial scale, forests are the biggest, the terrestrial forest.
Okay.
The peat swamps are more concentrated in some parts.
Concentrated literally and figuratively.
Exactly.
Right? In terms of geography, but also in terms of the density, as you mentioned. That's interesting.
Mangroves, then again, like this Southeast Asia, because of the geography and the islands and the extreme coastline, there's a lot of mangroves.
Of course, it's the surface area equation.
Exactly. Right. So that's where the carbon is. But in terms of time, right? When we talk about carbon sequestration, if you pay attention, whenever you talk about locking carbon, you're talking about 100 years. That's usually what a project is, right? 100 years is nothing. It's a blink of an eye when you look at a peat swamp forest. Exactly. You cut a forest down. It'll grow back in 20 years.
If left
physically, it will look like a forest again. Ecologically, it might not be. The animals are not there. Is it really a forest if there's no animals in there? It's just a collection of trees, right? The carbon might be there. And 20 years, okay, you give it another 50 years, you get birds coming in, mammals coming in, because, oh, this is a nice forest. In the words of old property builders, build it and they'll come. Right?
Yeah.
So if you have a restoration project, animals will find their way there. It'll become a forest eventually. But peat swamps, the peat lands, they take thousands of years to really get to that quality again. And in some cases, it'll never be that quality that was before. So the time scale, a 100-year project, for restoration, it has to be more targeted towards your tropical forest and mangroves. But if you're talking about conservation and protection, the peat swamp and peatland forests are the ones you really want to preserve, because the time it takes to get that carbon back is way long, much longer.
That's fascinating. I love that. Time, scale, they're the parameters here that we're talking about, the density component. That's really interesting. What are some of the pressures that are facing essentially the peatlands?
I think the biggest one is conversion to agriculture. I think,
are they fertile grounds for agriculture?
Yeah. It's the soil can be very acidic, so it's actually not really good for agriculture. But it's the social and the economic pressures force the conversion to happen. It's the same way in the mountains, the slopey land is not the best for agriculture because the nutrients leach out with the rain. But the social and political pressures make you can't avoid doing cropping there.
Of course.
So agriculture will always be a competing factor for any nature-based solution. It's one of the oldest professions that we have. We depend on it. I don't think farmers get enough credit in the our urban lifestyle
and in society in general.
in society in
And we all
general.
eat every day.
I always feel a bit sad when a farmer is usually the one that's poorest in a food chain of a commodity, whereas we depend on them. So
And we're industrializing that as well in the
exactly.
Western world, and that's got impacts with
And
regard to the
the pressure on an ecosystem by a small scale Asian farmer is very different from the pressures of a large scale industrialized Western farmer.
completely.
The
In
ones
terms of like fertilizer imports, runoff, the scale,
or
the
even
disruption, and even just the like.
or even the social and cultural attachment that the farmer has with the and what we often see in Southeast Asia or Asia for general is the farmland is usually very close to a forest, and that the link between the two is very difficult to break. As an individual, as a farmer, you spend a lot of time in the farm, but you also spend a lot of time in the forest. You have an ecosystem that was once a forested ecosystem, is now agricultural ecosystem.
Yep.
There's carbon there as well, but then you're still attached to the forest. And I feel like in Southeast Asia, that dynamic is very, it's actually very fluid.
Yep.
You have stuff that is forest becoming agricultural land going back into forest as well. So that ecosystem is definitely very dynamic.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
And thank you for that, because it's really elucidating in terms of having that perspective being provided, right, from someone in the field and looking at this as ecosystems, essentially. So identifying the density, the importance, the timescales are really important. Now let's take a step back, literally, again, and look at it from a scale perspective. So your role is essentially quantifying the carbon intensity and value locked in those ecosystems. I would imagine for forests, let's begin with forests, that it's easier to do so than on the peatland side. Can you walk us through the various different scales? Because my rudimentary understanding is we're looking at it from satellite, so effectively looking down. So now we've got essentially the scale of the pixels that can actually be sort of analyzed,
Quantified,
right?
yeah.
Quantified, thank you. And then the on the ground, or as close to on the ground. So we may have drone, then LiDAR, and then effectively physical sampling of the forest. Is that an accurate description? So can you walk me down, effectively step down from satellites all the way down?
I'll try and do the other way around.
I'll do the other way around.
Yeah. Imagine you're standing in the forest and you're looking up, right? The first thing you'll see is this giant tree that's covering it, right?
Yeah.
Just the fact that you have to first quantify the carbon in a single tree. It starts with a single tree first.
Single tree. Okay.
Right? The way is the traditional method, which is just because it's traditional doesn't mean it's obsolete. It's tried and tested.
Yeah.
Is you kind of assume that the tree is a cylinder. You measure the diameter at breast height, DBH.
Yep.
And you kind of estimate the height depending on what kind of instruments you have.
Sure.
And you have equations for converting that volume with the wood density into biomass. And then you convert that into carbon. That's the traditional way of doing it, right?
But now you're sampling different
points in a map. Exactly. So what we do is when we set up a plot, which we think is representative of the larger ecosystem. Right. And then we measure the carbon in a single tree and all the trees in a plot. So there's a bit of error already.
Of course.
Not only fact that you can never estimate the height or the shape of a tree completely.
And it's one time point as well.
It's one time point. Then you're kind of averaging or summing up the amount of carbon in that one plot. And then maybe you have 10 other plots. And then you're extrapolating it to the entire area.
Because it's impossible physically to actually sample every single tree in a rainforest.
Unless you could speak to ants and you could send out an army of ants and they'll collect the data for you, I think it's physically impossible.
Oh man, you're planning a lot of Easter eggs here, right? I've got a Doctor Strange vibe and then an Ant-Man vibe here.
Ultimate scientists. And then we try to do that at one spatial scale, which in some cases it's enough.
Yeah.
If you have a project that is maybe a few hectares or a couple of 100 hectares, it's enough. It's efficient, the method. It's both time and money-wise. But when you start going into thousands of hectares, the size of a concession or a reservation or a protected area.
Or a jurisdictional level.
Exactly. Then those methods start the error, that margin of error that is there in the way we calculate, it gets a bit too much, right?
Sure.
So how do you scale it? How do you go from a plot to a protected area? Is where the satellite technology comes in. And I remember in CMI, someone had mentioned that, what is the most neutral technology? I think it's space satellite technology. We have sensors that are looking down from the heavens every day.
Yep.
On the International Space Station, on other individual satellites, and they're capturing our world from a faraway perspective. But what they're also doing is that they are collecting temporal data. As the satellite goes over the same site again, you can
get the time scale and looking at over time. Yeah.
But the oldest satellites that we've been using is NASA's Landsat mission. The problem is that it's taking a photograph from space. It's a 2D image of a 3D system, right? And you can only estimate how much carbon is going to be that ecosystem by looking from the top. So what we try and do is we combine the measurements on the ground with imagery from the top, and we build models to scale up the measurements.
Great.
There's error there. I don't deny it. There's always going to be an error. But satellite technology has come a long way to the point where you can there's data available where we're mapping at a centimeter or 5 centimeter level.
Wow, that's a lot of granularity.
Exactly. Imagine having, a pixel this size of the whole planet, of the forest, of the mangroves, of the peat swamp. Peat swamp's tricky because you can't see it. You can't see it from the forest. But it's there. And at some point it becomes an issue of data processing and not the science itself.
Not the science itself.
So that's the scale we're working with.
Fascinating.
And then there are space lasers.
Space lasers.
Space lasers. There's NASA's Jedi mission. Again, now you have a Star Wars reference as well.
Okay, great.
Which is literally shooting a laser down on the planet.
Awesome.
To detect what is the height of the canopy and where the ground is.
Oh, wow.
And so this is a structural, like you've gone from a 2D image, which is a photograph, to now like a point in 3D space. Like, oh, so this forest canopy is this high, and millions of these footprints across the planet. The mission was supposed to go on for 2 years. It's gone past that now, and I hope it stays for a while.
So do I.
That data is invaluable.
I can imagine.
Imagine you have a snapshot from space of the densest part of the forest in Borneo, where it'll take you 10 days to get in, and now you have that data.
Now you have that data,
and you can better improve your estimates. So that's the scale that we work with.
That is a fascinating scale. Wow, lots to unpack, literally. Great. I'm going to have a quick drink and then have a thought about how we go from there.
Okay.
Cheers.
Cheers.
I like the $1 billion idea, man.
Okay.
Hopefully make that one go viral, yeah.
Then put it like either you got to say it if you had $1 billion.
Oh, that's awesome.
So there's only a certain generation that will get that.
That's okay. Gen Xers, we all get it. That's my audience, man. Yeah, let's get it.
But I think, but you have to understand Austin Powers to get that reference.
I'm going to do it. Don't worry, I'll stick to landing.
Okay.
Don't fall off this chair. All right, awesome. Roll it.
Oh, okay, right, cool.
So, Akash, let's dive back in there. There's so much to unpack. So we're talking about space lasers, and we're talking about the granularity that they provide. In addition to, obviously, the on-ground truthing, effectively the measurement piece, the older satellites that give you this broader 2D view, and effectively you're collecting or intermingling the data, right, to effectively get a better and more accurate view of the carbon content. Is that a fair statement?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay, great. So that's fantastic. But now being a kind of rational commercial actor, let me ask you a question. From a cost perspective, each one of them have costs associated, I would imagine, right? Yep. Sending people on the ground to sample the terrestrial forest is one thing. I can't even imagine measuring the biomass density of mangroves because they're notoriously difficult to penetrate.
Definitely.
But then now we're talking space lasers. Now we're talking in 2 orders of magnitude greater in terms of more expensive. So there's a cost question.
Yep.
Then there's a cost of actually analyzing that vast array of data.
Yep.
So maybe let's start with the second one.
Okay.
What does the computing power look like that's required in order to analyze that data to give you that higher level of confidence and granularity? And then where's that balance between the on-ground sampling and then the new, let's call it the new science, the geospatial side?
Okay. Do you remember how much RAM your first computer had?
Yeah, I had 4 megabytes of RAM.
4 megabytes of RAM,
Yeah.
right?
And then I upgraded to like a 16 meg.
And it was
And it was
amazing.
like the biggest step up. It was
Exactly.
2 orders of magnitude greater. It was amazing.
The access to computing technology has, the hardware at least, has become much easier for people like us. I could walk into Simling Square and I could, within a couple of $1,000, set up a computer that could rival NASA, the one that sent people to the moon.
Yeah, wow.
Okay, even better than that, actually, much better.
Probably more.
Exactly. But
it reminds me of like the old modems. I mean, we're clearly Gen Xers, but I remember the dial-up modems.
The sound in the back, right? Yeah. But here's the thing. It actually doesn't require that much hardware power to process that anymore.
Okay.
Courtesy of platforms such as the Google Earth Engine, right?
Really? Okay.
And software such as R as in just R.
Yes.
So what has happened is that in the last 10 years, open source platforms have allowed people to access processing powers way beyond what they could access 10, 20 years ago without having to break the bank.
Great.
For example, Google Earth Engine. So Google Earth Engine is an online platform. You run it in your browser, so you could run it on your iPad if you wanted.
Really?
And it has all the world's important big data sets available in the backend. You write code, but it doesn't run on your iPad or it doesn't run on your computer. You send the command to Google server, they run it in the back, and then they send you the results.
Oh, that's
Which means that someone with a Pentium 2 processor, in a developing country where that's the best resources they have, could process space data from their home or from their school, whatever they want.
Wow, that's awesome. I didn't even think of that. That is fascinating.
That is the accessibility that's available. And the Jedi data is available. The Landsat, Sentinel, all these data sets are available.
But there's a cost, I would imagine, to access that data, no?
You create a Google account, which is free, and that's it.
And that's it.
That's it.
Fantastic.
That's probably good. And for students, for researchers like us, it's great. And then the things that you cannot do online, software such as R from the CRAN network, they okay, do you remember trying to do statistical calculations in Excel? It's a nightmare, right? And then we used to have to figure out all of these different softwares or pay for them. RStudio is open access. It's free. You can download it, and it's a community of developers across the world. And I can install a small piece of software, and I can process all the data I want. And it's designed to run with machines that have the latest i9 processor to machines that have a small i5 processor from 10 years ago. It can run across all of them and let you process data, create models, create figures, whatever you want. You just have to take that extra step of learning how to do it, and that's it. And the cost is very little now to process the data. In some cases, for example, when I need to process large data, I have to have the computer running for a week sometimes.
Okay.
But
so there's still a time scale in order to compute those
depends on what you're trying to do.
Yeah, sure.
But for majority of scientists, PhD students, master's students, that barrier to accessing the processing power is not there anymore.
Okay, fantastic. That's great because that just reduced the barrier of entry.
Yep.
Okay, but there's still arrays of data. I don't even know what is it, petabytes, some order of magnitude greater probably in terms of the information that's there. So now I would imagine it's accretive. You start to analyze, you start to get a better view and calculation of the carbon that's captured in these ecosystems. You also see the competing interests in terms of deforestation. You start to see the reforestation, afforestation initiatives, and you see it over a time scale because you mentioned the time points. Okay, great. But where are we at in that? Let's go back to scale. Where are we in that scale in terms of mapping the biome? If I can just stump you with that kind of question, maybe it's a bit of a later question.
I just want to link it back to the cost part as well, right?
Yeah.
What is the cost of setting up 10 plots in a forest in Borneo?
Oh yeah, right.
It's everything from flying people in, the local support staff, the permits, the equipment that you need to get in there, the time that you spend in the forest, collecting the data and coming out. Collecting the data is actually more costly than processing the data right now.
Yeah, right.
It used to be the opposite some time ago. And then we have these two different scales of setting up 10 plots in a forest in Borneo versus launching a satellite into space. Okay, one has a very high startup cost, launching a satellite into space.
Sure, that's not for everybody.
Exactly, but I can still get 50 people going into the forest, covering a plot in 2 hours, moving on to the next plot. It'll be cheaper at a smaller scale, but that is cheaper at a much larger scale. the upfront cost often is borne by governments and the research industry, but the data, when it becomes available to the larger public, the per cent value of that data is so much cheaper there.
Because again of the leverage applied
Exactly.
here on
And
scale. Okay.
you're doing it from space. The Landsat has been up there for 30 years, and the cost that you spend back in launching it to now the data it provides, it's invaluable. So there is the cost of setting up on the ground versus the satellite. Now, I think if the processing power is available, money is not an issue to analyze data.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. All right. So that's great. So now we've taken me again through this very interesting and meandering path about your origins, how you came around to this, the curiosity that sort of sparked this focus on ecosystems and nature. Now we've gone from the bottom up and top down again. So now let's kind of fast forward and assume that there's a lower barrier of entry in terms of, like you just said, in terms of analyzing that data. So are we compressing essentially the error bars that we were talking about earlier?
Yeah.
So we're having a much more granular view of the carbon in these ecosystems. So that's great. Gives us more confidence to then ultimately determine the value of those ecosystems in terms of the carbon component and the tradable instruments. How do you see that actually materializing now in the real world? It seems that there's still a lot of people that maybe not have the expertise, or I should say most likely don't have the expertise that you certainly have, that are very critical of baselines and dynamic baselines, and that there's this overcrediting spectrum. But from your perspective, effectively, it's science. It's improving over time. You're reducing those error bars. I'd love to hear your perspective on that issue.
How often do you hear news about when a project has overestimated the carbon it sequestered? You hear it.
Yeah.
How often do you hear it when it's underestimated?
Never.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And
because those clicks don't sell for
exactly. So and the way the science works, the way it's done is that there are going to be errors, right? But sometimes the error will fall on overestimation, sometimes it will fall in underestimation.
Okay.
And that's it, it comes with the package. And the great thing about humans is that we can get together having very closed understanding of their own workspaces, but work together on something that's bigger than everything else.
Multidisciplinary.
Exactly. That's something we are good at. And I think if you're a leader in a carbon space, you're really good at bringing these kind of people together. So in terms of where I see the work going, right? I see a lot more scientists working with the private sector and the businesses.
Great.
I think 10 years ago, it's very rare to hear scientists talk to businesses. It was like like a cat and a Tom and Jerry situation.
Completely. We talked about that the first time we met. Because
Yeah.
essentially, we share some commonality here in my journey. But effectively, I said to you, I used to be a biochemist, but then I defected to the dark side. We had a
Exactly.
good laugh.
Yeah.
But I don't think that distinction is there anymore.
Not anymore. I
Yeah.
think now in the current generation, we accept that we have to work together.
Yeah.
And it's you and me versus the problem, not you and me against each
Against
other.
each other.
Right?
Yeah.
So I
That's
feel
great. I love that. I just want to focus on stressing that point. That's an optimistic view, but it's also really rational. Essentially working collaboratively to achieve and defeat effectively sort of mispricing here of this externality in regards to carbon, but protecting the actual ecosystems.
Exactly.
Right?
I remember this gentleman I spoke to when I was a master's student. He was working as the environmental manager in an oil company. And back then I asked him, like, what's it like working here? And he's like, the money is great, but they don't really listen to what I have to say, because at the end of the day, it's oil is the business. But I think that has changed now. I think it has moved where the scientist is not someone sitting in the back with crazy hair typing on a computer. The scientist is like, guys, I think this decision is not really great for the long term, and companies want to think about the long term now, and the scientist has a voice in these decision making, and I think that is absolutely important.
That's great.
And the fact that people listen to that voice is makes the scientist more confident, saying, okay, there's a space for me here where people listen, and I'm also willing to listen to the other end. At the end of the day, I'm like, I understand if this product is not made, for example, this company will not exist. But at the same time, I want to find the balance of the middle ground. So I think that is the current space of working in the industry, and I think that's great.
I think absolutely, and I love that to be more discussed more often in the broader narrative. So that's fantastic. I love that sense of optimism. Now I'm just going to round like home base here and ask you a question. And so I'm going to get a little bit serious. No, I'm actually joking. If you had $1 billion, I just just some Easter eggs in terms of different movie references that we've made throughout this conversation.
Okay.
But if you had $1 billion, where would you spend it in order to help to advance A, the science, and B, the outcome here around valuing carbon?
Ooh. Can't decide if $1 billion is a lot or it's not in the
Okay,
current
well,
economy.
just
I know.
X billion,
A
right?
blank
It
check.
could be
First, I would raise the
4,
salaries
10,
of
or 100.
postdoc students
Okay,
and
great.
PhD students. I think that's definitely.
No doubt, because that's a hamster wheel, right? Always seeking for funding and just being constantly in publication,
Exactly.
etc.
Yeah.
So
Sometimes even if you have the funding, the rent goes up and your funding, your salary barely covers it.
Yep.
I remember reading once, they said that in a perfectly idealistic society, the teachers would be the richest people.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they're not.
They're not.
So
So apart from that, I would try and invest more in space lasers, more LiDAR technology, something that can help us better understand the physical structure of the planet from far away. I think that's still there. Luckily, NASA's doing it, and European missions are doing it. India's becoming the space for launching into space.
Of course.
So there's a lot of data coming
and there's
there.
private sector actors.
Exactly.
Whether that's Blue Origin.
I would use money to get more field work done. I think field work is not appreciated as much. I think a lot of us want to work in offices in aircon, but some of the really good stuff happens in the forest. And getting people into that space needs money, especially when you're working across political boundaries in Southeast Asia.
That's not easy.
I mean, if you're the landmass that is US, or if you're the landmass that is Europe, or even landmass that is India or China, you are within a political boundary. Your one permit may get, you can work anywhere you want in that country. Whereas in Southeast Asia,
it's a microcosm of all these different interlocking different.
Exactly. And I feel like if I could use that money to make, the movement of science and data easier across the political boundaries,
Borderless.
I think I would try that as much as I can. I'm not saying I bribe people. I'm saying I would try and invest in technologies that help. I would invest in programs that encourage the sharing of data.
Yep.
I think that's where I would put it.
Fantastic. That's really great. I love that sense of optimism. Thank you for walking me through all of this and your journey. It's fascinating. I love to hear that scientific perspective. It's really important that it resonates, and like you said, it's incredibly valued. And I really feel that sentiment changing around the need for listening to science and that collective union effectively with the private sector, working towards a common good, right? We're looking to decarbonize. Let's have more granularity, more clarity around the carbon stocks, so we can have much more confidence to then substantiate the claims that are made on the other side, the transaction side, and then ultimately the retirement piece. And then let's just work together to effectively mitigate emissions and protect the ecosystem.
We got one planet, dude.
That's it.
We got one planet.
Awesome, man.
It's all here.
Cheers to that.
Cheers,
Thanks very much, buddy.
Thank you.
Thanks. Awesome. Cut. Right on. Woohoo! That was a masterclass.